Welcome Rollie Martinson. I'll let you introduce your guests.
Good morning. I'm a curious, a disciplined, curious fusser these days, which is another way of talking about action research. And so what I'm going to do with us this morning is create a sandwich in which we begin in the roots of a faith community I've studied, and at the end we're going to interview another faith community that I've had the privilege of observing and getting to know. And in between, we're going to wonder about what in fact is happening on the ground in the places where we're doing our ministry, and the ways in which we may or may not be responding to what's going on. Kent and Kimberly. Kent is a 18-year-old emerging adult, senior in high school. Kimberly is a 13-year-old tween, and they live in their day-to-day life in at least 3 mixed realities. They live significantly, virtually, digitally, in a whole variety of platforms, and they can in fact explain that life, tell you about that life in a host of ways. They live orally, face-to-face, telling stories and speaking to one another with a group of friends that they know in a variety of places. And they regularly live in mixed environments that are virtual and face-to-face, Kent particularly gaming, and Kimberly, as she experiences a particular group of women with whom she gathers, young women with whom she gathers, to both talk face-to-face and to build realities on their Facebook page. These 2 young people these days are members or hang out in a small congregation where they are members of a small group that is drawn together as a faith experience. One might call it confirmation on the one hand. That's what Kimberly is supposed to be doing now these days. Or senior high ministry. That's what the church thinks it ought to do with Kent. They're part of a group of 12 folks that live 24/7 online. The group is tended or guided by a 72-year-old, really fascinating woman who's as up to speed on virtual reality as anyone I've had a chance to talk to. Am I cracking up? And a sophomore in high school, a young man who loves to do what Jonathan talked about, and that is to get out and pick up with life itself and there ask really fascinating questions. So these 2 people are the coaches or the guides for this group of 12 folks made up of 7 people from within the life of this congregation and 5 who have been drawn into their life as they carry on 24/7 virtual connections and episodal gathering. Some of them are regular. They meet once a month as a group. and pick up on questions and affirmations and practice some of their missional spiritual practices together face to face. And other times, simply meetups that come out of the questions that emerge from the stuff of their lives. Crisis time, the group grew beyond 12. There were 16, 17 as others were drawn into the group. And now the question came, how will we continue to be in each other's lives if we are now 16 in the same way we've been there before? How do we do this? And how do we split up this group, and who are the next leaders? What's going on as I interviewed these people seemed to be an authentic, on-the-ground opportunity to be, belong, become, make meaning, and engage in lives that make a difference, both in terms of their individual identities and in terms of their shared communities. If one looks at their existence, it's really difficult to make up any pattern in terms of how church or the community of faith occurs in their lives in ways that one might recognize out of the past. They're inventing them out of the network of their day-to-day existence, and they're putting together oral, print, and digital realities in ways that enable them to live close to the ground in terms of their lives and close to the ground in terms of the tradition. Two elements out of the tradition function in their existence. They use, in this case, a theological notion of grace and vocation as one way to organize their conversations. And the way they organize those conversations has to do with three questions, virtually and oftentimes when they're face-to-face. The first is, so for what are you thankful? It's a countercultural question built on the basis that life is filled with grace, and so together they, over the 24/7 context that they have and the times they gather together, create a litany of thanksgiving that looks a whole lot like the Psalms writ large in 21st century language. Second question they ask is, if I'm going to live my life in a way that has meaning and makes a difference, how do I make meaning? What matters to me? What makes a difference? What is it about my life that I see as having significance? And the third is how to face the messiness that emerges as my life unfolds, as I seek to make a difference, as I seek to live my life in such a way that the world might thrive. As I listen to now three groups, they've managed to grow, split, reconstitute twice. I heard a litany of this process ushers me into becoming a more significant human being, deeper connections with my neighbor. I belong, I'm becoming. I have an opportunity to make a difference in ways that matter, and God is taking up residence in our lives as we build community and as we make things happen in the lives of other people. As I listen to them, I heard some of the following. And I want to take you for a moment. If you look on your paper, you'll see some of these 12. I heard a turning, a shifting in terms of what it means to be that we've heard about earlier today. If you look on your paper to the third slide, I want to simply set in front of you this litany to get a feel for what it's like to experience life as it unfolds with us today. I heard in the lives of these young people a 24/7 global village. The world was in their consciousness. A transmedia communication process. They wanted to speak to one another. They regularly worked off of print pieces, and they were constantly at life in a digital format. They were working out of a particular set of understandings of their particular time in the life cycle, and were working intergenerationally with others around them. They had multiple identities that existed in different platforms. They lived in multiple realities. They needed to be ever stimulated and to participate in whatever was going on. They had an existential, that is, how does this in fact speak to the basic questions of being, becoming, and belonging, ways of knowing that were highly experiential. They had layered diverse relationships. They had multiple dimensional patterns of how they looked at time, space, and action. They were highly secular. There was ethical diversity in what they were doing, and they brought a variety of religious stories, most of which didn't come from the major religious traditions. They came from other storytellers. And there was, in the way they practiced their faith, an expansive and a shift in terms of how practice, religious practice, was carried on. So my question for us, as we take this one experience of what one would look at and name or call a small congregation, that has in fact left its traditional ways of being and entered the everyday lives of its young people, and beyond their existence around church practice, has entered the lives of others now. Of the 35 or 40 people they have engaged in these activities, a third of them have nothing to do with their congregation or have little faith or religious background. What I want to wonder about is what Dana Butler Bass has spoken about as the great reversal. And I want to expand it out of what I've heard from these young people as beyond her understandings of belonging, behaving, and believing as the new way of, in fact, entering faith experience, to belonging, being, becoming, behaving, and believing scrambled. As I overheard these 36 young women and men in these three smaller groups practicing life and faith together, what I heard was entree points that came from a great many different places. Several had joined and become a part of this process because they wanted to be in a safe community where they could speak authentically their experience, where they could be who they were, and they could be joined by others who were living the questions. And so there was a combination of belonging and believing That is, what do I think? What do I know? What do I confirm? What provides meaning for me? Others in the process were asking the big question for them, who am I? And how many likes or THBs or whatever, TBHs, do I have next to my name? And which of these people do I want to be? And in these small groups, we're now working out in a direct way, out of their passions, their struggles, the questions that we're now in fact speaking into, this is who I am. And we're being connected with wise elders, people of similar passion, who are in fact on the journey with them in becoming. And the practices of celebrating Thanksgiving, wondering about how to live with my neighbor or my other in such a way that they might thrive, and facing the messiness of how this all unfolded, was in fact now the strength, the value added of being in blogs, interacting online, praying for one another virtually, gathering once a month to work with the questions that were emerging, and regularly coming together in meetups that included meeting at coffee houses and elsewhere. I'm wondering, as I look over the shoulders of the persons in this little congregation, early adolescents, later adolescents, what it means to be a gathering, worshiping, and learning community, and what it would look like for church to make the journey from wherever you are in your place to where your people are in terms of the questions of belonging, of being, of becoming, behaving, and believing. What I want to do with the two women who are with me, after they've introduced themselves, is to walk with them into one congregation, much larger, that is in fact working in this reality that's marked at least by these 12, if you will, characteristics that I've listed, as they work with the journey from birth through age 11, 12, to work with the families as they're constituted in the process of faith formation in the lives of children and the parents simultaneously. So, Jen, we'll begin with you. If you'll introduce yourself and what you do, and then speak a bit to the struggle and the journey as it's unfolding with the persons with whom you work.
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Jen Moore, and I work with the early childhood programming at Westwood Lutheran, and that would be the birth through kindergarten age group. The background for my position and why we keep fussing at Westwood, I have 3 boys, 6, 4, and 16 months old. And so as I come into the position, this summer, I had 2 of my boys in T-ball. And when we went to T-ball practice and we went to T-ball games, all the parents come and they relied on the expert, that parent that said, I'm going to take charge, I'm going to lead this T-ball team this year. And you can imagine what T-ball looks like with a volunteer parent. And what I notice is all the other parents, with their smartphones up at their face, they drop it down, they take the pictures of their child successfully hitting the ball off the tee. And then they would disengage again and be back in their little group that had come to watch. And there was very little community grown in that time, as our kids are all doing the same thing, and we're working in this experience of our child growing up. So take that to our church. My son was 3, and we signed up for Sunday school at Westwood. And I was so excited. I grew up Catholic. I had never gone to VBS or all these great Lutheran things my husband told me I was going to get really into. Look at me now. And at that point, I was so ready for our teacher, Carol, who knew all, to educate my child in the faith. And I would take him back after that hour when I had left him with Sunday school classroom, and I'd know nothing of what happened. I was not equipped to provide more faith conversation after that hour. And so in many ways, the Sunday school experience was like our T-ball practices. I didn't know my neighbor. I didn't know the people I was at my church with. And I did not know how to speak faith with my child. In fact, I was intimidated. I wanted my expert teacher there, the volunteer, to tell my child what they needed to hear so I wouldn't screw them up. Because, I grew up Catholic, and I didn't know for sure what I should say. So as I came into this position, I noticed all these volunteer teachers, and this again is birth through kinder. They start Sunday school at age 3. And my kindergarten teachers were burnt out. They were exhausted. And when I took what I had been received in the position, this is how we did it, and I gave them a giant curriculum. Here, there's so many options for you. Please do whatever you like. Please teach them what to do. Their parents will pick them up after the service. Just make sure if they have a snack, it doesn't have peanuts. Right? They were tired. The teachers were actually saying, can parents stay and help support us? Can we create a community so I could actually go visit my 20-year-old at college over the weekend and I wouldn't fear for your program. And parents did not receive that well. They were upset. How dare you expect me to fill in for your job? Teach my child the faith. That was an ugly year, and I learned a lot that year, and I was really disheartened. I'm in a faith space, and I feel like I'm at a t-ball game. Doesn't work. So what I changed the next year, and as I saw my own kids, and I'm experiencing the music here, I didn't know how to do it at home. I felt very insecure about it, and at the same time, my kids are humming songs, and they seem to know things about God that are very important. And I didn't know how to do that. So as I was going into the next year, I said, hey, here's the deal. We're going to drop that Sunday school model, and we're going to create a ginormous volunteer network. And every parent, every adult in your life needs to help. This is our opportunity to instill faith in our children. It's not an individual that gives it to your child. We know that, right? We know best practice is that parents provide, or adults growing in that child's life, they provide faith education. So Beth and I, over the last couple years, have been messing or fussing with this model. How do you allow that great hour of time where you have people and they're in a space with you and give them everything they need, take out the intimidation, and create empowerment? We can go further into what we're doing. I want to always say at the very beginning, we're in the trenches. We're not there yet. Every year it changes, right? And we knew that 5 years ago it didn't work well this way, and now 5 years from now what we're doing today probably won't be as effective and as helpful. So it's the switch gear. We know to empower parents, and then how do you do that with the small amount of time you've got?
So before you hand off, we go to Beth. What do you see happening now? What are you picking up?
So I was watching the presenter before, and you talked about that circle created of a religious community. We haven't changed everything, but what we've noticed is that it's a booming reaction. Families have created, we call them villages, basically now, and these families know each other. They know each other's kids, so now instead of you having to monitor your child in the hallway, we have really long hallways at Westwood, we notice that families are much more tribal, right? We want to have that feeling that they can be connected to each other beyond just that 1 hour. I'm going on a tangent now, but our model switched so that every parent would have to participate at least 3 times throughout the year. Parents stopped counting. They didn't notice anymore. At first it was, I know I have 2 left. I'm like, I'm not counting. Just come. And now parents are snuggling with their child. We know that most families in general don't get to be with their kids during the week as often. And you get them into this experience and you give them something that they can lead comfortably. We provide all the materials, we provide the outline, and we provide everything that kind of safety nets them. And then they enjoy the time with their family. And church time isn't stressful. We've blown out a section of our church. That sounds dramatic. We've moved a section of our church into a space where children can get cozy. We have rugs and children's chairs and tables and just a completely different approach. We were so ready for kickback. We had so many staff meetings. Okay, when they say this and react this way, we're ready for it. We're going to try this out. And now it's that thing that actually allows our worship to be more quiet. Families are cozy, children have their needs met, people are able to be less concerned about getting things that fall behind the pew or the kid that's running across the pew, and now they're actually able to hear what they came and were hungry to hear.
So Beth, you go from there. Just give it that one.
So I'm Beth Wolslegel, and I do elementary ministry at Westwood in St. Louis Park. And that was beautiful, thank you. We've just changed a lot of the ways that we are thinking about families and faith formation and how do we engage the congregation and multi-ages. And one of my big pushes in the last 2 years has been this whole drop-off mentality so that parents can go to worship. And so we've had a very small number of children in worship because education and worship overlapped. And my big push was to say, I think that we hold these 2 pieces of our tradition strongly, and I don't think that we can undermine our education by putting worship above it. And so made a big push to change our worship times. We did it. We changed our worship times 15 minutes. We had a half an hour in between, and now we have an hour of education in between. And that changed the way that our families think about our Sunday morning. It changed the way that our families think about education, because it's not parent drop-off time, it's actually parent engagement time. We changed the title of our Sunday school for elementary ministry is no longer Sunday school, it's Gift, Growing in Faith Together. And we are encouraging multi-generations to come in. It hasn't happened the way I was hoping it would yet, but we have parents who are present with their kids and learning together with their children, learning the songs, learning the stories, being able to take those things home. Jen and I have been very intentional about creating service opportunities so that we are not only talking about faith out in the world, but we're trying to live it out in the world. And then we do a service project for our community, and we do a service project for our house. And we create faith building pieces so that families can take something home with them, where they are equipped to do something different at home. So we made prayer cubes for the dinner table. We made giving plates. That was more of an out, but it was an in and out. We made a giving plate at the very end of the year and said, fill this plate with something good. And it had a prayer around the outside that thanked God for all the good things that were given and encouraged them to keep giving this plate around their community. What else did we do? We did prayer stories we did story rocks, where we created the parts of the creation story, and they could take those rocks home and kind of tell the story over and over at home. So we just were trying to be intentional too, to say, like, it just doesn't happen at home, and I know this from my own household. It doesn't just happen. It's hard to do faith at home if you haven't created some routines or you don't have the tools, and so we just tried to be open to say, what are the tools that families need to make this more easy?
I want to follow up on a couple of items you mentioned. What you did to the sanctuary. What did you do? What's your intention, and how is that building into or becoming a part of the worship experience itself?
I think as we prepared to change the worship space, it became very clear why we're afraid to change the worship space. The history of the pew, the way we've designed our worship space to be, that is so deeply entrenched in our souls as a way of doing something right. Noticing that I sat there as a child, I learned how to behave, I did this, and that we have this new generation that just likes to mess it up and make it easier and doesn't want to learn the traditions that are so important to us. And so one thing that I find myself knee-jerk reactioning to, especially as I bring my little people, my own children, into the worship space is, why am I there? Am I there to teach them to sit in that chair properly? Which is kind of what that really was about. Or am I learning as a family, bit by bit, the pieces of worship that help me go into the world? So the big takeaways that why we come to that space. I look at my kids now as they sit at a table, and they're usually doing some very, they're making paper airplanes and they're coloring, and I hate to say it, there's a monster truck cut out every once in a while. But then their heads will perk up and they'll say something that the sermon was about. They'll say words, or they'll hear a repeat on a refrain, and they'll start to look over at what's happening. And that was not happening when I was shushing them and trying to make their papers quiet on that pew earlier in the year. So what we're finding is that the folks that probably wouldn't come at all because it was too stressful, right? Parents don't want to stick out. We always say, oh, just come. We totally welcome you into the space. It is extremely stressful to have a crying baby in the middle of the worship space and be like, yeah, well, you said that was okay. No. So to provide the things that we need so that we can engage in the FaceTime. I think it's so lovely. We have all these communities that we don't see each other, and it's very cozy that way. But for us to be comfortable to engage with each other face to face, it's, again, blowing away those old expectations, evaluating why we had them, and then making room for these new models.
The service, assignment, process, invitation for families, how does that work?
During the lesson? Like the service projects or the worship service?
No, the service projects.
Okay. Well, we just throw it in there, to be honest. So I don't, did you advertise what weeks it was? Okay, yeah. So I never told families what they were going to get when they showed up on Sunday morning. It was just a big surprise. And so I intentionally had it like the second and the fourth Sundays, which we were on the same page, but I just didn't know if you advertised it. So otherwise, I see Rich Melheim is here. We did most of our curriculum and gift was the Faith Five. So we would come together, we would share, not necessarily a high or a low, but it might be something to do with the story. And then we would hear the story, we would talk about the story, we would do an activity around the story. So these things that we did, these story stones around the creation story. It wasn't it wasn't a random connection. It was trying to really connect what we were, the God's message and the story and our home message all together. And then we would pray together and bless one another. And it was this super simple outline of a curriculum, and it was pretty much the same every week. They just never knew quite if they were gonna do an activity together in this kind of village mentality, or if they would do a service project and get kind of all mixed up, or if they would take something home with them that day.
Just piggybacking off of that, so we didn't sound like we didn't know what we were doing. That was in different ways a lot of the time also. But one thing we know well is that families come about once a month, right? That's a healthy church participating family is about once a month. And I think in the first year when I was in the position, felt like we were mad at them or shaming them, that was not okay, and that they were the ones that needed to change in order for our programs to run well. And it makes sense, I mean, because we're coming from a great tradition. I mean, in our community, there was Saturday singing school, and that was huge. And so to say that things have changed, but these folks are still just as devoted to our community, it just looks different. It was kind of a bitter swallow for a while, and now we've overcome it. So then changing how we, in Sunday school, would have you'd have your group, right? And you'd sign up at the beginning of the year, and it was really on your family to get there every week, because now you had to make sure you were there, and it wouldn't always work for those families. And that's what I noticed as I came in, is that the attendance was all over the place. Children didn't know each other better or worse, even though they were in this one little pod. But you could feel the shame from the parents. There's so much apologizing. I'm sorry, we didn't, we couldn't, and all those things. And that wasn't what this should feel like when you come to a worship space. So one thing that we've changed, and this is a learning for me in the last 2 years, I started taking from the Sunday school model and turning it into a village so that it was families, and then they would still be in their age group, but then the parents would all have to happen. And we call it farming off your children, because if you have more than one, it's a bummer at church, right? You chuck one in one room, and then I'll see you in an hour, and then we'll switch and flip-flop, and very stressful. So then from that year of trying to keep the Sunday school model, keeping it though with the family model as well, I regrew it, saying, okay, now you should stay as a family, because that's what it's all about. So keep all your kids in one spot, and we'll have that same idea, but now there's a 3-year-old with a kindergartner. We're going to treat it like a real family is, where we learn from each other in our different ages. And even that hasn't fit perfectly. I've noticed that still, as families come in and out, you're missing like 3 children at once. And so by the end of last year, from this village mentality, we've kind of amoebaed into a large group that can easily divide without stress, still being led by the parents, but this feeling that when you come in and out of this community, we're not mad at you if you come or don't. We're just grateful and loving that you're here. And that you could feel by the end. And that's where the parents started to know each other better. And absolutely, the ones that came more regularly have a stronger knit community. But then those who were less frequent attenders, they didn't have to apologize anymore.
So I want to bring this around and wonder about 2 questions. As I interviewed the participants in both of these congregations, what I heard in each case was these communities are engaging us, me, others, in places where I live in a way that makes a difference around life's fundamental questions. Questions like, who am I? Does life matter? How do I live in the messiness? How do I make decisions? Where do I belong? Is someone at my back? And regularly I heard people coming to the experience, not from other churches, but from being at sea in an environment where they did not have places to work those matters generatively. So I heard, what does it mean to be? This is a quality community in which I can belong, I can find out who I am, I can in fact become more of who I am. The behaviors here are significant, not only engaging me, but engaging the world. But what was fascinating in all of that was the believing question was as big as ever. And it was that way that it got put together. Not so much was it having some truth stuffed down my throat, but it was now living the questions and having a community in which to explore possibilities, options, the tradition as a part of living the questions. So in 2 really very different congregations, and I happen to be looking at the first third of life with the two of you, particularly the first 10, 11 years, and their families, and in the second congregation, looking at a congregation that saw itself to be very small and clumsy in terms of working with confirmands and senior high people. In fact, lamenting the fact that once the youth group that they had had was no longer in existence and they had nothing for young people. In this congregation, now they have young people engaged in processes that are more in number than the average worshiping attendance. So where is worship? Where is learning? Where is community in the life of this small parish? Well, certainly it's at the heart of what goes on continually in worship, but it's taking place now in the pores of day-to-day existence of young people themselves and adults participating with them in the process. So for just a few minutes, I want to come back. Where do you want to take this? We're finished. We've used up the time. Sorry about that. Well, thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for coming and being a part of all this.